Please join me in welcoming Anthony, and Anthony will give you just a free open forum for a couple of minutes to tell us a bit about yourself, okay?
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you for the introduction, Jeremy. Well, actually, let me start with a couple of questions. How many of you here are actively involved with a startup or starting like early stage startup? Wow, a lot of you. What about sort of mid-tier, sort of like evolved startup, right? Any established companies here? Oh, a few. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and talk with you a little bit. I thought I'd start to address the concepts around disruption a little bit. I did a startup in Canada in the early days when startups were not sort of in vogue. So I'll take you through that sort of legacy, the history of sort of what I did in my career. But maybe just to start with disruption. I mean, disruption is an interesting term. You probably all hear it. So when you're doing your investor pitches, you're probably trying to contextualize your startup around its disruptive nature or disruptive characteristics that are possible around it. It's kind of a negative term, though, when you think about it. You know, to disrupt something. You know, when you think about the term itself. The reality is, disruption, or the ones that I've experienced that have been progressive, are actually inspired. It's inspired progress, right? That's really what it is. It's inspired progress. There's a latent need, an untapped need in the market that startups, really, the whole essence of a startup is really to go after that sort of latent need that's not there. So you're not really disrupting something. I think I've never liked that term. It's kind of a post-rationalization. It's like, wow, the automotive market just got disrupted, right? Sort of you're post-rationalizing something. It's important to keep that in context because you'll be asked about the disruptive characteristics of your company. And I was always asked the same thing as I sort of started off in my career as an entrepreneur. We'll get into that a little bit more, but just to go back in time, I started as a brick and mortar architect, not actually in technology. And I think that served me extremely well. So if I look back, starting as an architect, sort of naive about technology, what was happening in the world around technology, it was back in the day when the browser was starting to come onto the scene, for those of you that remember. So Netscape. How many of you are familiar with Netscape? You heard well, of course, you're all in tech, you should. So I kicked off my career. And Jeremy's looking at now. Jeremy knows me way too well, so you're not allowed to ask me any questions actually, because you're gonna. But if I look way back, you know, the browser opened up this possibility of a window into the world that was so unique and new, and it was so compelling. But the use cases weren't established yet when Netscape just came out. The first kind of browsers were on the scene. There was a browser war. Who was going to be the next browser? Who was going to be the window into the internet? But the internet was still very, very young. And I remember thinking about it as a young architect. You know, what are the possibilities? What would that mean to me? At the time, the tools in architecture were very much centered around documenting a building. So the tools, the computer, was oriented to delivering a tool to the market that would help you draw a building. But it wouldn't help you necessarily be creative. And I think what started to inspire me in my early career is I worked for an architect named Renzo Piano. I don't know if any of you, are you familiar with that architect? One of the top 4 architects in the world, actually. Designed the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Kansai Airport, a lot of very famous structures. His approach, which inspired me, again, he was one of my mentors in my early career in terms of, as I look back, he really mentored me in terms of thinking through how I could start a disruptive technology myself. But the way he approached the computer was that he approached the computer, in spite of the fact that it was just for drawing at the time, he approached it as a design tool. So he used it in a very unique way as a design tool. He kind of took the deficiency of what computers were doing at the time and kind of tried to flip them on. He was disrupting the use of the tool in a context. And I think that was the initial inspiration, is that you could take a tool that is maybe not suited to a particular purpose and you can adapt to it. You can adapt your processes around that tool and use it in a unique way. And that's a form of disruption. The technology didn't change. It's the approach to how it was used was being changed. And that inspired me already in early days to start thinking about this. I was a young architect. As I went to do my thesis in school, I studied at the University of Waterloo. I was one of the first architects that used computers in a way to generate the form of the design. So I used algorithms. I kind of scripted some algorithms, and those algorithms produced a form. So I was disrupting also the context of what does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to design something and use technology as sort of an impetus to be able to create a kind of a way of thinking about it. So in my early career, there was that sort of disruptive attitude, but it was about not creating a new technology. It was about using the things that were there and kind of using them in a unique way and combining them. I think that's very important for those of you that are starting in a new startup, is that you don't have all the resources. You can't really go back in and build a protocol, right? You can't build a technical protocol. You don't have the resources to go out there and do that. But you can take a few different ones and mash them together. You can think about open source in a unique way, and I'll talk a little bit about that today if any of you have questions, because we use a lot of open source in the world that I'm in today, and I used it historically as well. So moving on, as a young architect, I started to get interested in technology and potentially doing a startup more and more because I designed the head office for Silicon Graphics in Canada. Does anybody of you remember a company called Silicon Graphics? Yeah. So they were amazing because they really went after compute as a platform, but centered around the GPU, right? So the graphics processing unit was at the core of their value prop. And a lot of those people that were working there went off and founded NVIDIA. How many of you know NVIDIA, right? You know how, right? But they took the sort of concept of that platform and said, rather than the whole compute, right, the whole computing infrastructure, I'm just going to take the graphics card out and make that a business. Now that's disruption too, when you think about it. It's saying a component in a broader platform could be called out and productized, and therefore enable a market, because they became enablers to all computers then, right? So that thinking is very interesting. So I was designing their headquarters, and we were high into visualization at the time. So that was 1997, 98, when it was all about visualization, because the computing, the gaming systems weren't there yet. It was about visualizing things and making it look like you could make the computer make it look like something was real life. So I got inspired by that as well, and there was a disruptive nature to that as well, the concept of visualization. And so as I thought about doing a startup, I started to think about introducing all these factors. The computer is inherently creative. The operating systems at the times were Windows-driven. Browsers were really just rendering HTML, so it was very limiting. The experience wasn't there. So what if you could pull together the concepts of the power of the graphics card, the way the internet, the window onto content that everybody was sharing on the internet, and how the computer operating system worked? Could you kind of pull those things together in a unique way? And that's actually what my company Visible, set out to do when it was initially founded. It was disruptive in nature, but you don't necessarily set out to be disruptive, right? You kind of set out with sort of an inspired goal, right? You set up with an inspired purpose. And then you start to disrupt by the nature of not having a lot of resources and having ideas, and you want to sort of make something work. You start to think about how to disrupt technology by introducing new ways of doing things. And that's exactly what we do. We said, what if we stopped focusing on the CPU for the internet and started focusing on the power of the GPU? And what could you do? And it was interesting. With my initial small team that I had kind of pulled together between students at the University of Toronto that were studying to go into aerospace technology, right? Mixing and matching a few very young, sort of intuitive developers that really had no predetermined way of thinking about these components because they hadn't built enterprise software before. We got together with a small team. We started to contemplate this. What if the GPU could take a more primary role in the internet? What would it mean? And one of the initial innovations that we developed, which was very disruptive at the time, is taking for those of you that are more technically oriented, taking the document object model, which is what structures the web, and encapsulating it as a graphics card format, and then putting that on the back end. So any content that was IP enabled or web enabled could be driven through the GPU to the customer. So we were able to create these really immersive, compelling experiences of video content, analytics content. We were able to visualize content. We were able to take normal web content and present it and unify it on the screen. And little did we know what we were disrupting was the integration market. So this is kind of the other thing, is as you start to play with the technology, you start to kind of see the possibilities around it. You start to look at the market when you've sort of started to disrupt technology, and then you look at the market, and then you start to see where the potential real disruption could be. And for us, as I went out to raise money in the early stage of my startup Visible, which was 1998, 99 when I was really getting going. What was interesting is everyone was trying to create the promise of integration for the browser. How could we integrate everything to create these unified views, these portals? How many of you are familiar with portal technology? You've probably heard the term, right? It was a big thing. Enterprise companies were investing billions of dollars in foundation and platforms to integrate and create portals to support sort of how you would aggregate anything. Well, so what started to happen is the simple premise of using the GPU to power all this content and aggregate it on the screen and render it in a unified way without having to go into the back end and integrate it was sort of disruptive, because now we didn't have to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on projects to rationalize the back ends to get content unified and presented on the web. So these were, and again, I didn't start out by saying I wanted to disrupt the integration market. I started out by saying, wouldn't it be compelling to change the user experience of the web by bringing the GPU forward, presenting content in a unique way, right? So it starts sort of more right there. And I think all of you should be very open in your startups to look at those lateral possibilities as you move forward. And I think don't be too presumptuous about your business model either, because if you're innovating from a technology perspective, eventually you'll find those possibilities if you can kind of stick with it. So we developed some patents which were quite robust and were granted them by the USPTO. So we were very successful there, and then went out and did some rounds of financing, and it was really interesting because I think. And I was very lucky because the initial funders of the company, the investors, were as passionate about the idea as I was. And I think that's also something that's very important, because your investors are your network, but they're also there to support you as an entrepreneur. And I think you need to look for that passion. They shouldn't be sort of distanced from your idea. I think you need them to want to participate in your idea and the formulation of your strategy. And so it's important in the early days not just to look at the money aspects from an investor perspective, but to look at how they can support you and be as passionate as you are in the ideas that you're putting forward, especially disruptive characteristics of what you're doing. So pushing forward, just so that I kind of put the whole context in place. So created this startup, worked this startup through, got great investors, and eventually had a great opportunity to work with AT&T very strategically on introducing the technology for its broadband user base by reinventing how the browser would actually work. So at the time, they were thinking through how could they compete from a browser perspective, from a search perspective, and the user interface was core to their thinking, and that's where my company was innovating. So got some great strategic partnerships there, partnered with Intel. We were part of the CS show, and we got up on the stage with Craig Barrett and presented the new next generation interface to their Vive platform. That was one of the things that we had been working on in the early days. So we had Intel as a partner, Warner Music, we were doing a music player for them. I mean, we had a lot of really compelling use cases, because at the time, browsers really weren't doing anything great in terms of user experience. Everybody wanted the next gen user experience. That was then. I mean, that was in the day when the compute still didn't have a compelling user interface. So got a lot of amazing, we worked with EDS strategically on command and control capabilities. So the company started to grow very quickly. We were seeing companies that really wanted the capability, and they came in, and we were enabling them. So the company started as an enabling company where we would provide tools and services and enable other companies to do sort of exceptional, really creative, cool things with next generation user experience technology. Eventually, we decided to create our own offering to market, and that was quite interesting, where we would enable anyone to come in and build unique digital experiences and publish them online, which also sort of took off on another direction. We were very open to looking at things that way. We could have just focused on the enterprise business, but we wanted to create new product offerings, and that kept us always laterally thinking as a business. So eventually, the company got acquired. We got a strategic relationship with AT&T. And they took controlling interest in the company for a while. Eventually, the intellectual property, we did a second liquidity event, and were acquired by OpenText, which is, how many of you are familiar with a company called OpenText? Have you heard of it? Great story. I mean, amazing company. They're in the information management space. But where they started was they were the original search engine for Yahoo. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the history there. Canadian company, right? They started, incredible story. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tom Jenkins, who's the chairman of that company, I know him from my past, and he was very supportive in acquiring Visible as we move forward. And it's interesting because the context there was, how do you think about information in the future, right? Where does it go? Where does it ultimately, how do you generate value from information? And the great thing about the company is it started by helping companies like Yahoo, disruptive companies on the web, help them with core technologies like search. That was sort of the original in the founding of it. So there was that inspiration from this company to think about what is the future of information? how do we represent it? How do you pull it together? How do you visualize it? And how do you generate value from information for corporations? So there was a great fit there. So I went there, worked as a VP of innovation there for a while. So I was helping OpenText innovate using technologies like this. We were working on innovation. Eventually started to run the customer experience management practice, which is web CMS technology, media management technology, customer communications technology, put it all together into a suite of products and sort of launched that business strategy within OpenText. Built that business out over about 5 years. And we were competing with companies like Adobe and others. So it was heavy lifting, but we got there. And OpenText is now one of the front runners actually in this space. So they've been doing very well. So I had a great tenure there. And then eventually I was tagged in to help Canadian Tire. So today I'm at Canadian Tire. I run the digital technology teams at Canadian Tire. I ran the data teams and as well the digital e-commerce teams for the corporation. And that goes across all the banners, Sport Check. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Canadian Tire portfolio, but Sport Check, Atmosphere, Marks, the Canadian Tire retail brand. So working with open source technologies and integrating them to provide compelling customer experience and compete on the world stage from an e-commerce perspective. So was that 15 minutes? I felt like it was more than that. But I kind of zipped through it. There's a lot there. Pretty good. Great. So happy to open it up and go down any path. I've got some more topics that I could go through, but maybe if there was any
questions?
Yeah, any initial questions?
Yes, sir.
I have an early question. So it seems now, I'm having a technology venture as well.
Oh, is it on now?
Hello? Okay. And it seems that the current marketplace, capital markets, let's say even angels, don't like the technology plays as much as they may have in the past. Platform plays, technology plays, they want to see a real application. Yeah, okay, it's great you have a platform. You have to have a real application. You have to be going after a real market opportunity.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, is that your view nowadays as well, or you think you could still get a pure technology company off the ground? Of course, there's opportunities for the technology, but more of a platform play.
That's a great question. I don't really think it's changed though. I don't think there is a platform that exists as a product really. I think there's always a core application that drives a platform. I'm a believer in that. I think if you don't have a good sense of how to apply it or what the core, at the end of the day, what was inspiring about NVIDIA and taking out a component and turning it into a platform was the enabling characteristics. But gaming at the time was really the compelling sort of use case. I think you always have, great platforms are all founded on compelling use cases. And I think you have to have those. If they're not, if you don't have a sense of it yourself doing a platform startup, you really won't be. I think there's just more stress now on the application tier, right? I think because platforms have been disrupted, right? I think when you look at it, platforms always started from the bottom up, infrastructure up to, the presentation tier, let's say. And I think because so much has been disrupted at the infrastructure level, I think it's very hard to look at the platform value proposition, even if you've got a real play there. And the ecosystem is changing so fast. I mean, open source. I don't know how many of you apply open source, but it's progressed just, over the last 5 years. It's made such huge progress. It's been so normalized into not only the corporations in terms of how they invest it, but in terms of how effective open source is. How well you can use it. You can take it without a lot of extra work and really implement it in the enterprise stack. It's really compelling as where we've gone from that perspective. So happy to share insights around that, but I'd be very careful, even if you thought you had a platform value prop, if you don't have a clear sense of your disruptive use cases that are driving that platform, definitely be very careful in the early days. Yeah.
No, I mean, I see it, I get that, and we have applications, but it's a matter of, what if your platform is so good that you can have so many applications, then it becomes problematic, right?
Right, but still there is a driver to the platform itself, right? And you need to know what those drivers are in terms of what they're inspiring initially to get that catalyst out there. And usually, it's okay to have a broad vision for a platform and start with small incremental use cases that you think will drive its usage to prove it. You shouldn't stray away from those smaller idiosyncratic use cases. You think they're not the big thing. They're not it's not the word presser on the new Mac, right? I mean, you can start with smaller edge scenarios to prove out the viability of the platform, and then the community could bring you the big bang, right? They'll figure out maybe what the bigger plays are. But you have to have a good sense of what those proof point use cases are and make sure the platform is really working for those initially. Yeah. Otherwise, it's a hard slog as you go forward.
Other questions? Paul will give you a moment to think about a really great Yeah, you've got lots.
There's one at the back, in the back corner.
Yes, sir.
More like a comment question on there. Hi, thank you. Sorry. I've been here. I've been over to York University. I've been over to City of Toronto, Mars, J Labs, on and on and on. 5 words down, you got their word innovative. Everybody now, innovative is a new buzzword. 20 years ago, it was green.
Right.
Now everything's green. Dog poop is green. Coal is green. Oil sands are green. And now innovative is the word. Innovative,
It's the
innovative,
big word.
innovative.
Yeah.
There's nobody on this planet
Who's
more
not
innovative than me, and I can prove it. Okay? The problem is that innovation alone doesn't work. It's like going on Dragon's Den. They don't want you to be innovative. They don't want you to be hip. They don't want you to be cool. They don't want you to be rad. They don't want you to think outside the box. They want you to have a business that's going and ready to go ballistic.
That's right.
And that's the problem I'm having.
It's such a good, it's a brilliant question, actually. There you go.
Okay.
Excellent. Well,
Get that microphone
and
back.
you know, it's interesting. I actually have an answer for that. So I think a lot about innovation. I was the VP of innovation, and I think a lot about innovation. I have a problem, just as I have a problem with disruption as a term, especially a term that will motivate startups. I just have a problem, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. There is one factor to innovation that gets missed. So innovation is a big part invention, right? So somebody coming up with a new thing, right? That you've invented something. It's uniqueness, let's call it. But what's interesting is if you really study innovation, innovation doesn't happen without adoption. So it's interesting, I remember in my early days raising money, because I went everywhere to raise money. Jeremy knows this. Wasn't shy about raising money. I met an investor who will go unnamed, but and I learned my biggest lesson. It was interesting. Of all the demos that I did and all the discussion around the future and the possibilities and the progress we had been making with big enterprise customers, I went in to a very seasoned investor one day, and I remember he stopped me mid-presentation, which I had seldom got. I had really compelling demos, and they would always let me go through my presentation just out of interest for what the offering was. He stopped me midway, and he stopped and said, "Your problem is adoption, not invention. Inventiveness and adoption are worlds apart." And it's very important to understand that, because your adoption strategy as a company is not necessarily aligned with your invention or the way you invent or the way you create disruptive capability. You have to actually separate the two. So innovation only happens when adoption occurs. Okay, that's the actual real sort of definition of innovation. Invention doesn't require adoption. So you could be inventive and you could invent something and you could get a patent for it, but that's not innovation. Innovation has to be driven into the market, and the adoption has to go with it. And that's why you have to contemplate. And those two things seldom actually go hand in hand, right? In other words, just because you've built an invention doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get adoption. You might have to do different things to align the adoption and create the adoption opportunity. And I have some examples of that. I think there's a follow-on question.
By adoption, I guess you mean implementation of that.
No, I mean
No?
adoption. So you could be considered innovative, but it's not innovation unless the market actually accepts it. Because then it just sits as inventive. Oh, it's great, that's inventive. But innovation, right, the term itself, really what it means is that you've generated the adoption. So people are using it. They've connected with it, and it actually compels usage in the market. And those things, you have to treat them differently. You can't assume that inventiveness or the creativity in your inspired idea is necessarily going to generate adoption. So what he said is, you will be successful only if you can focus and be as disruptive about your technology as you are with your adoption strategy. That was his message. And I walked away feeling like I was I felt like I had a university education at once, right? So it's interesting what you can get when you go out and you raise money. You need to sort of generate that dialogue, because you'll gain some really compelling insights if you're open to it. And he really helped that investor, yeah.
I feel like that's one of the jewels of the morning, Anthony, inventive versus adoption. That's a really, really great takeaway as it relates to the subject of technology. I remember the first time I was lucky enough to go into the Visible offices. I remember schlepping up the 5 flights of stairs, because those who know me know I hate elevators, and the elevator in this cool building was really scary to me. But what an awesome office there at King and Spadina, and full of all these amazing and innovative people. And the first time I got to sit down with Anthony to actually look at some of the capabilities, think about some of the framing that Anthony's just given us this morning. So it was like, look at the capabilities of what this platform can do. I was stunned. Now you rewind the tape and you think, okay, it was 2007, we'll call it, something around there. You weren't seeing this kind of inventiveness inside a web browser. So it was like shocking to all of a sudden see the Warner Music catalog, for example, run across a browser in full 3D, right? But you're looking at a 2D image. And the way that they had figured this innovation out, I remember sitting with you saying, okay, so how are we going to sell it?
Yeah, exactly.
Who goes and buys this? That's like so incredible.
The business model.
And that's back to your point about inventiveness versus adoption, right?
Exactly.
Brilliant invention. Now we got to go out and convince a market to adopt it. And once you get Warner saying, we'll present our music library in this format, there's a form of adoption to take your innovation into the marketplace.
And you have to be as creative about the adoption side. It's not, tech companies tend to invest so much in being creative and lateral thinking around the innovation of their protocol, their components, what they're offering, but they miss that they should treat adoption in a similar way. Be as open and creative and inspired around how you want that uniqueness to kind of find its way into the market. And be really open to that. I think some of the best companies disrupt on both levels. There's three areas. The model, you could call that the model. There's the technology, but then there's the architecture, right? Which is kind of the form factor as well that's really important, and you should consider all 3 of those if you truly are trying to aspire to be disruptive. I think the problem that I have with disruption, just to go back to the point, is disruption happens in little fits and starts. It happens, it's not an event, It just like when people say, well, you're disrupting the market or you've disrupted the market. It's interesting because if you look at it, it takes time. It's a process, and it happens in bits and pieces as something evolves, right? It's truly an evolutionary process because things don't get disrupted overnight. And you have to ask your question too: is your goal to be disruptive, or is it to support progress? Is it to be progressive? Is it to ensure that you're looking at status quo from the right perspective? Because often, again, if you're asked as a startup, how are you disruptive, it changes the way you're thinking about your work. And I think it's always important to go focus back on the small things, the small wins, the things that are compelling you, the creativity in it, and driving that into wherever you can in niche markets to drive that adoption, because those are those initial steps, right, that potentially then could create an opportunity to be more fundamentally disruptive. Right? So there's some discipline there that's important.
Yes, sir. Right here in the front. Yep. Oh, sorry, if you can hang. It's more so that we can capture it for the podcast. I know everyone in here can hear us, but
absolutely. Just wanted to ask a question on the changing landscape of retail and e-commerce. I remember back in 2006, I got into technology really early, and I got hired, I guess, by a big retail agency here in Canada. Mm-hmm. And then my second day in the job, I was asked to go down to St. Jacobs, Ontario, to go meet with one of their biggest clients, Home Hardware. And I was a digital guy, and I was going into this major retail account for them. I was really nervous because of my second day on the job. Driving to St. Jacobs, Ontario in February is also really challenging as well.
Right.
And I remember that I was there, and it was had to go meet this gentleman. He'd been there for 30 years, and he was a visual merchandising manager for the store. He said, Raj, no matter what we embark on together, he grabbed his little shopping cart from behind his desk and he rolled it in front of me. He goes, all the buzzwords and technology and everyone, what they're talking about, at the end of the day, it has to lead to more things going inside here. And I said, like, from a retail perspective, do you find there's downward pressures on, with all the new buzzwords that are floating around, like, AI and cryptocurrencies and blockchain and all this stuff? Like, do you look at the end of the day, there's a lot of pressure on just getting sales in terms of the e-commerce experience and really everything that has to lead back to sales?
It's, again, I hate to go back to some earlier comments around the platform, but it hasn't changed. I mean, disruptive technologies and opportunities have always been there since the day of the browser. I mean, it's hard because we look back and we go, wow, this new thing, the browser, what's going to disrupt all these markets? Now we're talking about AI and big data. Big data is a huge theme, right? And then there's the AI that goes with it. And the more data you have, the better the AI is, right? You could liken that back to the browser and how that's going to disrupt retail or other models, right? And so I just think it's important to always put that in context that so technology is in a continuous evolution, and it's continuous. It's just how what your filters are and how you orient to it. But my background in architecture has really helped as well because we were taught about empathy being a key driver. That means your ability to observe needs in the market and how empathy is very important. I think retail is an interesting example. Retail, but most markets. It's what are the customer behaviors? It's not AI. It's what are the behaviors that you want to either nurture or enhance or create or take advantage of, if that makes sense. I think one of the phenomenons now is the fact that everybody has a mobile device and chat is such a compelling use case. That was not driven by enterprise or retail or any of those businesses. It was driven by a desire for people to connect and communicate in a very particular way. Question is then for whether it's retailers or enterprises or startups, is how do you advantage? You've got a platform of behavior. You've got certain behavior patterns. What do you do? How do you think about those behaviors? Are they advantageous to you? Now do you introduce AI to take advantage of those behaviors, now compel a transaction, like what we're seeing with voice-activated search, right? We're seeing those new use cases arise. That's when it starts to coalesce. It's not big data, it's not AI. It's the fact that now I'm willing to speak to my device and ask it a question. That's the behavior. The behavior now has to translate into taking that mix of new emerging capability and put it together in a way where you can drive a business opportunity out of it. And that's really the way I think we're thinking about it. We're thinking about it like that in my company now. We were thinking, even historically, I think we've always thought that way from an innovation perspective. Yeah.
Yes, sir. There's a question here. Sorry, Lisa, that's a long way around.
It's okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Hi, Anthony. I have a question about alignment regarding funding. I see a trend that brick and mortar, larger corporations, this came out of the innovation comment at the back, that it appears that in order to capture innovation opportunities, sustained businesses are creating innovation venture capital funds to try and capture innovators like this room to get a hold of that opportunity. Where it comes for us, my company is through the angel investor stage. We're looking at our first venture capital round. And we're very cautious about whom our first venture capital will be. Will it be OMERS, which they own half of SAP or a lot of SAP, but we interface with NetSuite and all the Sage products as well as SAP. You see where I'm going? Sure. Or Rona Ventures, but Home Hardware and Canadian Tire are key potential clients of ours. How do you see Canadian Tire fitting into that venture, and how do you see a company like Canadian Tire responding to a potential provider that they know is venture capital funded from one of your competitors?
So your question, though, is in context to your startup, right? In terms of funding,
in
like
general.
Approach to funding, because I want to make sure I answer well.
Yeah, how do
You're looking at it from your perspective, say, that funding ecosystem has evolved, and there are a lot of dynamics, and even institutions that are known for funding innovation, they potentially have conflicts and they have relationships, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate all that. Is that fair?
Yeah.
How to think about it?
Yeah.
What domain is your startup in?
We do online wholesale information exchange.
I see. So it's a particular, right. I think it's always hard to navigate the funding ecosystem. That's one of the reasons you use sort of ventureLAB as an example to help you sort of navigate that. But would I hesitate to visit multiple forms of funding and go there and sort of do your demo and make your pitch? You should never feel like you have to be segmented into, well, because this investment group invests in AI, I'm just going to go there and sort of, because they get it. I I'd say you should be very much more open to the investment ecosystem, but you have to know what you want out of it. So I spoke to it a little bit earlier. In the early days for me, it was ensuring that I had investors that were as passionate as and compelled about the idea that I was. Right? So it's very important though, because you have to test those assumptions for yourself. Where are you at in your evolution? What are those initial investors? It's not just the money behind it, it's what do those initial investors represent to you in the progress you need to make and how you want to make that progress. Because it's going to help you then decide, do you want to work with an enterprise that has a vested interest or that is potentially going to look at you in a nepotistic way, right? Because they have a vested interest in your technology, maybe they, because I guess one of your concerns is, hey, if I go down this route, they could stifle me because they have an interest and that could be counter to my success. And I've seen that a lot. Should I go with this investor because maybe they're biased or not? Or if there's a corporate entity, because a lot of the corporations now have investment funds, and you're concerned that if you piggyback with them, that they could stifle your market because you're going potentially in a different direction if you pivot. Is that fair as well? I think when you get to a point where you're more established and you know where your foundational use cases is, then I think you can play that out a little bit differently because you'll be able to take advantage of money coming from enterprises. I think you have to be really careful though, probably in the early days, to make sure you're getting investment from environments that are going to support you moving laterally and pivoting, because you don't want to be restricted in the early years for that pivot. As you go to growth models, you definitely want to take advantage of that ecosystem because they're looking to partner with you. They're looking for taking advantage of how you can work together, and there's usually real synergies there, and taking some of that money is often a real catalyst. So I would definitely, but it depends what stage you are, and again, it's about where you're at and what your needs are as an entrepreneur, in being selective about who you're visiting and what they represent to you, right? So for me, it was very much, if you're not as passionate about the ideas I am, that's a difficult thing in an early sort of disruptive technology company to be able to have investors on that, and the network around them. The other thing is that the network around your investors is incredibly important. I remember I got the opportunity to meet with Jeff Bezos. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. It's a bit of a sidetrack, but to your point. And it came from meeting a potential investor that became an investor that I wouldn't have imagined that somehow through another party they had a connection to Jeff Bezos, right? So I remember getting the opportunity, and it was through an investor who was excited about the opportunity and the idea, passionate. And I remember arriving after all the preparation, arrived in Seattle, went to the corporate office and arrived there. And of course, young entrepreneur, you think you're actually going to get a meeting with Jeff Bezos, right? You actually you're naive enough. You got to stay naive. That was one of my other messages. You have to stay naive because opportunity comes from being a little bit naive as you go through your journey. And of course I arrived there and Jeff just, he wasn't really available that day, but his key associates were. So he had set up a team, which is his advisory team that did meet me. And it was an amazing, amazing experience. Because what I learned in that session was you should have a team of very smart people that think very openly and laterally about your business that will look at opportunity for you. So actually my lesson was in the fact that I didn't get to meet Jeff. It was in the fact that he had a key team around him that was thinking very openly and laterally about possibility. And they were not retailers. They weren't people who knew how to sell CDs and books. These were biochemists, electrical engineers, because I had asked them, what's your background? And they were multidisciplinary, right? So I learned a big lesson there, and I know I'm sort of in a circular way answering your question, but who you surround yourself and the network that you draw into and where your money is coming from, you have to be really thoughtful about that because it could open up several possibilities. And so you need to think of it that way. It's not just the money that's going to compel your strategy. It's the network behind it and those people that are associated to it.
I have a question, my friend.
Yes.
I'm going to try and paint this and connect the dots. The knock against Canada as a marketplace is often the lack of adoption, the risk adverseness of the Canadian marketplace, all those things we've all heard about. Yeah. You've had an opportunity in your career now to work inside two great big Canadian brands. Mm-hmm. So you've done it as the startup guy trying to sell adoption in.
Right.
You're now very much a guy who's responsible and in many ways influencing adoption into big multinational brands. I'm wondering if you can, and please, I know you'll be honest, but please be honest. Can you
Sure.
paint us an optimistic or bleak picture, because it'll be one of the two, about whether or not Canada from sort of 2005 into what we'll now call 2018 is understanding better that as a global marketplace continues to be the predominant thing that all scale-ups are learning about, is Canada now, the big guys that need to take the lead, are they adopting technology or are they still risk adverse? Do you feel optimistic about this?
That's such a great question. It goes to the core of actually our relationship. Because one of my frustrations in the early days, because I was, when I started out, it was very hard to raise money in Canada. Actually, I actually only raised a little bit of seed money in Canada when I did my startup. I mean, we were at Deloitte Fast 50, Deloitte Fast 500. We were at $10 million of revenue in a quick turn, yearly revenue. By all means, we were sort of one of those companies that you think you could go around in the Canadian ecosystem and raise money, or you could go to Canadian companies and they would become your customer on a foundation like that. And I think in retrospect, I look back. So your question is a very relevant one. I look back and I think I only had one Canadian customer throughout that whole journey. Because the Canadian market is problematic from that perspective. I think the Canadian companies don't necessarily invest as well as in the US market in their startups or upstarts. They don't take advantage of that as well. Now, there's a lot of things that we're doing to try to work around that, and Canadian Tire is definitely active in the community, and we're doing much more to look at those early stage companies, and so it's something Jeremy and I have been talking a lot about. So it's definitely changing. But your question is interesting because it's quantitative. Like, really, how far have we made progress from the day when it was hard because Canadian companies, because technology wasn't, in their mainstream way of thinking, they would go after the big platforms, the established platforms, instead of looking at those more emerging companies and sort of integrate it into their offering. And then the funding strategies behind it were similar. It's like, if you hadn't partnered with an IBM, or at that time we partnered with EDS, if you hadn't partnered with these kinds of companies, you were sort of not validated yet, even though you could be very disruptive and you could potentially have a counter value proposition to them, which is what one of the things we did have. It was very difficult for us to get the investors because they wanted you to have that. It was almost like a security against the kind of the market, right? So how far have we come? I would say there's a recognition that to stay on top of the disruptive characteristics of how technology is evolving, that you need to play in the startup ecosystem. You need to participate. You need to be aware. Canadian companies, big Canadian companies, the ones that I've been in, they want to be connected to that ecosystem. They want to be aware. They want to understand what you are doing as companies. But I think what they struggle with, and I think it's both sides, I think they struggle with understanding impact and value because they're seeing it from a growth perspective. They need things that are going to compel their business and be very strategic. They're also looking at it from a talent perspective. And I think if you're a startup that can speak that language and know how to connect with the enterprise in terms of how they see the world, you can be quite successful now in this current market. I think that if you struggle with that, it's very heavy lifting. But if you can make those connections at that level, I think so. It's important to understand also how you fit into the broader platforms and the broader ecosystem. You're not going to find a big corporation like Canadian Tire or OpenText that don't use and don't work with industry platforms, right? Platforms that are well established. And so it's important that you demonstrate how you fit into that framework. Because that's what I do now. If I see a startup, we're working with CMS technologies, web technologies. There's a lot of versatility there to plug in new startup capability into kind of a web capability. Those models are there. But what would compel me is to understand how you've already thought of fitting into that ecosystem or where you play longer term. Because if you're kind of like a satellite innovation over here where I don't understand how you're eventually going to fit into the ecosystem of capability that's out there, that's very problematic. That doesn't give me the impetus to invest in you because I think you're not thinking about that broader ecosystem. So just a word of advice to help you get into those corporations, you have to have that perspective. You can't just say, I'm the coolest thing over here and I'm forging my way through here and this could really be compelling. I'm compelling, but I'm compelling in context. And I'm working it in context. And I know how those things come together. And that would give me an opportunity to meet with you and bring you into the corporate discussion and dialogue in a much more substantial way, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it
Lemay?
does. Yeah, thank you. Probably drove, yes, sir. Probably drove some questions.
What if it's a completely brand new ecosystem? What if it's a completely brand new ecosystem, one that doesn't exist today? How would you approach that?
I think there's always a context. So you would need to explain what it's like. Like I always, when I mentor startups now, I ask them what they're like, not what they're dislike, if that makes sense. Because it's easy to say, well, I'm not like, when I started, I'm not like Windows and I'm not like a browser, and I'm like, well, it's hard to understand. So if it's a new emerging ecosystem, you need to be able to say it's like this ecosystem that established itself and kind of revolutionize the market or change the market. It's this ecosystem here is like this one. They're not the same. They're different and they're on different curves, and and this one's going to be much more compelling than the last one. But you have to put it in context. So it's important that you have a sense of saying it's like this or like that. Like a lot of the companies now that are in the AI space going in and talking about machine learning and neural networks and all that, you're going to lose everybody. If you talk about Moneyball, for those of you who see the money, you talk about sort of compelling narratives that help contextualize the power of a technology. It's what are you like and what do you associate yourself to, so your investors and your ecosystem can start to really understand you and where you play. You really need to invest in that. You need to think about that, right? Yeah.
Okay. Another question in the back here.
I think the last 10 minutes of what you guys touched on is bang on, because I think the Canadian companies still, their hardware and analog and a digital and software world, they want to learn, and I think they're only doing it because they're forced to, because the rest of the world is going on. And if they don't do it, they know that they're going to get left behind. But
Right.
they're still, like, it's good that you're doing these companies, but just they're still lagging behind. Like, they're still running the race in last position. They have to turn, like they know they have to turn around, because if they don't, they're going to be left behind. But I can't figure out how to get it.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard for all corporations are facing the same dilemma. I just think that rather than big vision to compel keeping up, I think it's just looking at, to go back, the simpler things. If you keep pace with customer behaviors, right? If you think about what customers are doing and how they're engaged with technology, and you keep pace with that thinking, and I think you can stay ahead of all the technology innovation and disruption that's out there. I think we lose sight of that. I think we got to keep up with those that are doing the best neural network capability, or using big data to the best advantage. At the end of the day, customers are really where regardless if it's an enterprise customer and you're B2B or B2C, you need to look at the behaviors and the patterns there, because that will help your business focus on the right things rather than get caught up in the hype around emerging technology. Because if you're not applying even incremental innovation to behaviors that are going to compel your model, you're toiling in the wrong areas, and it won't bring you down the path you need. Remember, disruption doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, it's a methodology, it's work, it's hard work over time, and you need to be focused on the right kind of work. That's why my litmus test is I always go after, what are the customers doing right now out there? Where's the friction? Where are the pain points? What are they wanting to do? What are they using a lot now? What are they compelled to do? And then go back and look at AI and all these other things in a context, right? Because it's difficult. You need to kind of always think from those two ends, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, when we started off in our venture, it was always about the technology. We talked about the elliptic curves and what have you, completely lose people.
Right.
And then we soon realized that it's about the use case,
Right.
and sort of contextualize it within those contexts. And, I think for us, in the last maybe half a year, understanding that, and that it's not really about the technology, because technology, it's always changing, evolving. It's more the tool. And understanding the use case that you're applying it to is perhaps the most important thing. So, I mean, I completely agree with your point in terms of chasing technology. Understand the sort of the ecosystem that you're in, and sort of contextualize it within that context so it actually makes sense. Completely agree.
Yeah, it's good thinking.
Thank you. Questions? Jeff. Sorry, just bear with us when we get that mic to you.
Or if you have
I'll try and address.
Exactly.
Great presentation so far. I've had the opportunity to work a little bit with Canadian Tire through a couple of my ventures, and I'm interested in your perspective of working in a franchisor-led, franchisor-owned model that tends to have epicenters throughout Canada that are historically family-owned over a couple of decades or a couple of generations, and introducing not only innovation but adoption to that sort of model. And what are sort of the challenges of that, and what are sort of the strategies? Because I think that speaks to the larger issue that we all have.
Great question. Very good question. I mean, I'll liken this, I don't want to use the wrong analogy, but go back to the platform and app, because the way I look at it is it's really the question is decentralized or centralized. If you think about it, it's where does innovation happen is the question. You can think of it as saying, I'm going to develop this platform, and I'm going to innovate here, and then everybody is going to figure it out for me, right? I mean, this is it's does the app come first or the platform, and does decentralization work, right? So that you have a lot of people trying to figure out how to make something work because they've got vested interest in their stores and their locations and the model, or does it have to be centralized in terms of how it's thinking from a structural perspective? I think you have to do both at the same time, because I think part of this is that if you look at the most successful platforms, they're driven by innovative adoption right at the edge. And so what we want to inspire is we want to inspire it from a holistic perspective, and we want to support that. We want to support the inventive entrepreneur who's working it every day to make things great. At the same time, that's big data and AI is not accessible. So we need to kind of work it at the platform level in a more centralized model and then open it up. But if we don't have an ability to allow innovation to happen at the edge as well, where they're there daily and inspire that, I think you don't build that connective framework and you're trying to push innovation in all the wrong ways. So I think you have to balance the two. I don't think corporations that are thinking with purely centralized models or purely decentralized models, I don't think either of them will exist, win long term. I think they have to strike that balance. I mean, we see this in emerging platforms like IoT. It's funny, you look at IoT and you think about the big value around IoT, and because it really is a decentralized framework and a new protocol for touching the world in a whole unique way. And you would start automatically by saying the established companies that have a vested interest in connecting everything, those ones are going to drive the innovation into the market. It's actually the edge cases, the ones that are hacking the Raspberry Pis, it's actually happening at the edge. Now the protocol has to happen. You need to rationalize the protocols in the middle. So there has to be that evolution, and those corporations will help guide that. But if you don't have that reach and at the edge you're inspiring that kind of innovation, then the two things actually don't work, right? So they have to coexist if that helps a little bit.
I've said many times over the years, I wish I could clone that brain of yours. I've learned more things from Anthony just chatting like this. The trick is to try and get it out to share with more people. And one of the things that I remember you telling me a long time ago that plays exactly to what you just said to Jeff was, I remember you saying one time, all the analysts on Wall Street busy following Adobe about how Adobe's going to disrupt the market, and all of a sudden in 2007, out of nowhere, Dropbox happens.
Right.
And it just so perfectly illustrates your point about inside as well as the edges, and the smartest industries and the smartest companies in the world are very thoughtful about watching closely at both, because who the hell could have predicted Dropbox?
No, for sure.
But there it was, and all of a sudden everybody was chasing it, and it disrupted a global marketplace immediately, and it was a startup.
And it influenced the other corporations in terms of their information management strategy, which was really interesting as well, because you would imagine that something disruptive like that wouldn't find its way into the enterprise the way it did. And I think that's something to be very careful of. I think we need to build platforms that will support and sustain all the enterprise use cases, and that's what tends to happen, versus saying, if I'm reducing friction for a customer, and these are the behaviors that they really care about, and I'm enabling that, those will find their way into the enterprise. You should trust that. They will, because if you've solved at the customer and helped reduce friction for them or done something that they feel there's value in, eventually that will work its way into the enterprise. And so, but you still have to work it at both ends, because if you don't think of it, if it won't scale, or you haven't thought about the platform. So Dropbox basically figured out the infrastructure that could support a highly distributed model in terms of how to manage content, right? You have to work both ends, though, right? I think that's why it eventually was somewhat disruptive,
Right.
because they thought of it from that perspective. But I would, litmus test again to go back to what are those use cases that are reducing friction for a customer or helping a customer do something different or better, and then bounce that off your tech innovation and say, how is this relevant or not, and recalibrate that constantly. I think at Visible we rebuilt the platform 4 times. But it's funny, as I look back and we rebuilt the platform based on Java evolution and the GPU evolving, we rebuilt it 4 times, but every time we rebuilt it, it got smaller and smaller and smaller, not bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of where its focus was. And that meant, I think, we were making progress. Because when you think you need all these features, and eventually you realize there are a few very key important things that are driving 80% of your value proposition. And then you're rebuilding your platform to those and making sure those are central, right? That's also important, is that you think about every time you, and as a startup, you need to always imagine yourself rebuilding what you've built. Don't think about simply evolving your tech stack. You should take points of reference and say, we got this far, now rebuild it. You should really be brave enough to do that, because I guarantee you when you go through that process, you will innovate just in the nature with you stepping back from your platform and saying, no, I'm going to pick another platform, work different tools into this, and then re-go to the market. It will service you very well in your thinking process, because you're disrupting yourself a little bit, and I think that's an important thing to do as a practice. Don't be fearful of rebuilding your platform for your company as you go forward. Rebuild it a few times, and it'll benefit you quite a bit.
That's great advice. Let's shift gears for a second because of the ecosystem we're a part of. I'm wondering what advice you might give, Anthony, and I'm saying it from the perspective of, let's take a big institution like a college, a university, a hospital, a municipality.
Right.
From the perspective of technology, which is the subject of today, and disruption and adoption, what advice would you give to large institutions, public or private? I've given a bunch of examples that happen to all be public, but public or private, because of the difficulty I think that they sometimes experience trying to adopt technology. So I just while you're thinking of this through, I was at a town hall with the mayor of Markham a week or so ago, and he laughed. He said, all the work council does to engage citizenship and get people out to town halls to discuss the important topics that are important to the citizenry. He said a young kid in a startup company he jokingly said, some meetup tool I'd never heard of before, the night before, and put 200 people in the room. And he joked and said, we would be loath to have that many people in council chambers to a public event ever. And we planned months in advance. And he was just using it as a way to illustrate large institution with set formats and ways that they do things.
Right.
And recognizing we live in a time where we've got to force ourselves to change and think differently about how we adopt solutions. As a guy who's built his career as an innovator and a disruptor, what advice would you give to a large institution, and in fairness, private or public, I shouldn't just pick on the public ones,
Right.
about what they need to be doing to adopt technology at a faster pace than they probably are doing it right now?
It's an interesting question. I think, I want to go back to sort of maybe an underlying theme to all of this. Is curiosity is an interesting characteristic, and you often find the best entrepreneurs. You see, there's certain characteristics, there's certain qualities there. I think curiosity is a huge. You hear people talk about this all the time, but curiosity is a really interesting thing, because if you can inspire an established enterprise that has a process and a methodology, if you can inspire curiosity amongst the senior and middle tier and junior, the people that are just involved, you inspire a curiosity in the right ways. And sometimes you have to approach it as curiosity. What's happening out there? What's next? What could we be using? I mean, these are simple questions that I think corporations they find it hard to kind of step back and take that time to ask those questions and start to be curious about what's happening in the market. I think what they do though is they go, this new thing called AI, we have to take advantage of it. Now go try to take advantage of it. You see, without being a little bit more curious about what does it mean, what does it represent, where is it being successful, where it's not, in that whole process around it. Inherently, as big enterprises become big enterprises, they have a methodology to generate the income and solve the problems that they're solving. So to take a step back and say, can we be more curious about things, and how do we approach that curiosity, I think would inspire them at least to have a perspective. I remember in working with Renzo Piano, and this goes again way back. It's funny how in your early life, there are certain lessons you learn in mentorship that comes back later as you're trying to scale a business. Well, Renzo used to do something, Renzo Piano as a designer used to do something very interesting, and it comes right back to maybe a better answer to your question. Renzo Piano would look at things always at scale, and so at huge scales and at small scales. He would look at the detail of a building at the same time as the site plan. Okay, so we talk about sort of different scales, right? Different ways of seeing it. But in designing, he would contemplate the two scales at the same time. The detail, let's say, at a tech level, it's the code, it's the protocol, it's the algorithm, and massive adoption, right? But they would coexist in his frame of reference as he was thinking about it. And I think what's hard for big enterprises is they have this macro view of the markets that they need to disrupt and they need to grow exponentially, right? There's this big demand. And at the same time, they've got people toiling in the corners trying to build capability, right? You have to look at those things simultaneously. You can't look at them independently. You have to pull them together and have a frame of reference of how they work together. Because what's interesting about the market today is an algorithm can change a market. Right. So it's very compelling when you think about it, right? But those coexist in the same frame of reference. So to help these companies sort of break free, they have to be curious about that dynamic. They have to be curious about how those things fit together in terms of their discipline, and just engage the market for what's so compelling about it, and open up that dialogue. Because I think we fall into these patterns of, well, what's successful? What can I apply? Go get a team working on AI. But how do you really apply AI in a way that could compel the result? You have to have a different frame of reference around it. You have to have that perspective. And I think that's where the bigger corporations today struggle a little bit, is that perspective on how these things could work. And just being open to the possibilities themselves, right? They want to apply them, but I think they move too fast to, applications versus really thinking about how it could meaningfully affect their business or their strategy, right?
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Yes, sir. Another one?
So you see as a major corporation that the way to innovate is to, you mentioned open source earlier, or for large companies to actually acquire. I saw recently that TD bought Layer 6 for an undisclosed amount of money to advance its AI development in-house. So do you see working with partners or acquiring or building with open source or all of the above?
It's got to be definitely both, because the worlds actually are playing very nicely together more and more. And I think you need to take advantage of that, because there are established use cases that are core and central to businesses, and then there's sort of more emerging and cutting edge. But what I'm finding is actually the opposite. So there is open source now finding its way into those established use cases, and vice versa. Some companies that are innovating around the edges, that are providing those edge cases, typically you'd go out for open source. I actually think that it's balancing itself now. Like, for example, the big data stacks. Open source is very compelling when you're talking about big data, and that's a foundational, the old domain of thinking about information management and ETL, so these processes, these batch jobs to create sort of value out of data, and how that whole methodology, how it can be disrupted by putting in a big data capability that thinks much differently about data at its core, at its root. It's not a relational database. So we're finding that open source technologies are coming right into the hardcore use cases, the root use cases in the corporations. And then, established companies are moving more and more out to the edge and innovating at the edge and saying, no, we've got innovative feature. You can plug in and work backwards. Every time we meet with established companies that are helping with the data and analytics space, this happens all the time. We ask them, how are you using open source to your advantage? Oh, well, now we're innovating at the edge a little bit here. You see, so these open source is pushing into the core, and then the core is helping these established platforms that typically had that domain start to innovate out at the edge a little bit more, and it's balancing itself out. So I think it's a great time to play in both of those worlds, because that balance is actually happening. Yeah.
Hello, Anthony.
Hi.
So you mentioned for a company, in order to be very innovative, the management team had to pay quite a lot of curiosity to emerging. Is it technology or more about customers? Because you mentioned, it drives a huge value for the company to pay a lot of attention to customers to see what they want.
Right.
Now, it's more about technology or customers that we should be more curious about.
Yeah, I think that is the essence of disruption, is that innovation requires adoption, which means you need to understand the customer. The culture, actually, it really is the culture, because some things are early. You'll be able to do something at a technology level that's too early for where the market is. Timing is everything as well. I mean, that's one thing that I learned, because I really think the innovation that we were providing was very much ahead. We were fighting the market because we were ahead of the market in terms of where those use cases could go. So you need to strike that balance, because if you're not in tune with the culture and where technology adoption is possible and where that sort of psychology is in the market, you might be innovating something that is incredibly capable, incredibly important and relevant, and you know that the market could use it, but they're not ready to adopt. It's not ready yet. It's kind of like, if you think about where we've come from a mobile perspective, I guess one way to think about it is that imagine if when mobility was first enabled, rather than having the brick phones, the big phones and the flip phones, and it was all sort of numbers based, right? You were basically working a keyboard, right, concept, to where we're at today in a full compute device that is all about home entertainment and your photos and everything else. Those were worlds apart. If we didn't start here, the question is, if we could take this and move that fast forward and not having had to go through the evolution cycle, would this have been as successful as quickly? I don't think so. So it's important to put that in context. The market is ready for what it's ready for. You can always push a little bit beyond the market or take a niche market that's more ready than the other market, but be very sensitive to that. Because if you're just simply saying, I've got the next best thing, it's touch enabled, it's a full compute device, but you introduce it in the market not at the right time, I think you'll struggle with that as well. And that's what I mean about being sensitized to the customer and where they're ready to adopt and what they're really engaged in. And it's a very cultural thing as well, right? So I think being sensitive and then balancing that with where your technology innovation is in your life cycle and connecting the two. Right.
Yes, sir.
What advice would you give to a startup company that's developed a new technology, has a new type of lead applications, brand new ecosystem, hasn't been validated? So the challenge is on the adoption piece, right? How does a startup with very limited resources go and validate the sales channel, the adoption of this new tech, this new application that's being rolled out?
I think no matter circumstance in terms of where your technology life cycle is, there is a market for it. You just have to find it and make sure that initial market is validating what you need it to validate. Because if you don't have an ecosystem yet, there isn't an established market. You're very cutting edge, you would say. I hate the term, but you're cutting edge, you're bleeding edge. But you have a sense that it could compel a market to adjust. You still have to find a niche market within that possible market. You need to address it. And you probably need to compromise a little bit of what you're doing to make sure that that initial market can use it and validate it for you so then it can get to the next level. I think that's your challenge. If it truly is where you're saying there's no ecosystem for you to play within, then I think you really need to focus on those niche markets and make sure that you're aligning that technology to those and working it so then you can emerge out and broaden out your market opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely a market for it. I certainly believe it. It's getting my potential investors to believe it, right?
Well, my point is there either is or there isn't, though. So if you're not, you need to be far enough along to say, no, it is real because I've gone to that market and I've demonstrated that they see the value. And remember, it's hard because as entrepreneurs, you see the value and you present the value and you write the narrative. But until your customer tells you the value, they can say to you, this is the value I'm getting. That exchange hasn't happened and you haven't established even your niche market. So you need to try your best to have your customers tell you what the value is of what you're doing and then understand how that plays out in terms of your initial market and then your broader market. Because it's interesting, as you do that, you'll validate some things and you'll invalidate other things, and that will help you with your investor base as you move forward, if that makes sense.
Another question?
On the retail side, can you give any examples in Canada of any brick and mortar or online companies that are inspiring you, that are like, these companies that are doing it right, or you've walked into a store experience and like, wow, it's awesome, or an online experience where it's like they've done it right?
There's so much out there right now. I mean, everybody seems to think that retail is fundamentally being disrupted. I think what's interesting about retail is that retail is about products that people care about. It's about products that people need every day in their lives, and context is everything. Because people find themselves in a context where they need something or they want something, and it's really that sort of environment. I think the most compelling technologies are those now that are looking at individualization as a way of compelling and supporting a customer through their journey on the buying path. It's an emerging model because you've probably all heard of personalization, and that means sort of how do you create a personalized experience, right? So that when I arrive at a website or experience an e-commerce site, it kind of knows enough about me to help guide me through the process, because I don't want it to be a generic experience. But you also don't want to go too far the other way and try to think you know the customer well enough where you're proposing specific solutions to their problem or specific products. So we've seen the counterbalance of that in the market. If you think about Facebook, what it's going through in targeting you too well or thinking they know you too well in your feed, those types of things. But individualization is something more interesting. This is what's compelling me most in the market right now. Individualization is more tuning the experience to support your inclination as an individual, your needs at a much higher level. It's not like I'm going to pick the perfect product for you at the perfect time, but how I message you, how I connect with you, how I service you, right? How once you've done a transaction, how well am I connected with you? How did you feel about that service? Would you like it installed? It's that engagement. It's an engagement. It's the way we connect with the customer base and creating that full life cycle engagement model that I think is really the most important. And there are companies right now working on it, if you look at it. And the channels of engagement. So at the right time, an email is relevant to me. But at a different time, a text may be more important, more relevant, because I'm in a context. I'm in a store. The text is more valuable than sending me an email that I need to read through. Those sensibilities, right? So a lot of companies now are innovating around the edges there to say, what are the channels and what are the right moments, and how do I engage a customer on a more contextually individual basis so that it's not always the same buying journey, but it's connecting with you at the right time based on what you're trying to do. Those are the companies that I think are most compelling right now to me. Those that are thinking through that whole customer engagement life cycle.
Well, yes, okay, let's take one more and then we'll pause for a partner update.
Hello, hi. Thank you for all the comments so far. I didn't want to ask a question too early because I'm probably going to ask you to change the gear again. So I'm a professional advisor from a place that I'm sure you both are very familiar with. I worked 2.5 years at Community Tech. So my expertise was focusing on helping tech companies working with emerging market, and my strict focus for now is mainly just Chinese market. So 2 parts I want to share. First of all is I've always been amazed at how much of similarity there are when I was helping companies with that market compared to what you would advise for companies overall here, because it's literally looking at from the same methodology in terms of the business logic and then the same way of finding the context, but looking from an extremely different and a fast-changing lens for Chinese market. And also, as we're talking about the factors that are disrupting the Canadian entrepreneurs that we should be aware of, in addition to AI and blockchain, all that stuff, one thing I've picking up notice on is also the vision of global market or the scalability of business that we help here. So China is becoming more strong in some areas, or maybe the leading market, for instance, in the e-commerce and then mobile payment. And then my friends joke that they will build the fast train to us before we can take the train to Kitchener. That's just a joke, but my question, that's a long way to come to my question to you, but I'm curious at, given the relationship changing between Canada and the States, Canada and Europe, and the effect that China might play in the future world that we have to be prepared for, I want to learn about what's your experience in terms of your exposure to Asian market. If it may not be a huge factor right now, but have you seen any changes or anticipate any in the future? And I welcome both Jeremy and Anthony to answer this. Thank you.
I personally don't have a lot of experience with Asian markets, but I do from an innovation perspective have a perspective. I think I think what's interesting and compelling is that now more than ever, we are looking to those markets to understand the future. So we understand how quickly things evolve in those markets, and we've watched the pattern of innovation there. So I think we're more sensitized to it, and I think we look at it, we're curious about it more and more, and we're trying to integrate those methodologies. Like, it's compelling. You see markets there where they emerge, where hackers are normalized into the production methodology, right? So you'll go there and you'll see unique phones emerge out of the market, but that's from underground, and they have the means of production there. So you can get 100 very unique cell phones created there, which is compelling when you think about it, because here, that's normalized within the core, where you can create these unique devices. Whereas here, you'd have to go out, start a startup, you'd have to get the means of production, you'd probably have to be second stage before you could get a hardware device hacked out into the market. And right? So they're able to move so quickly because it's normalized into a methodology there, which is deeper into the way they innovate, right? I think we need more of that, definitely in the Canadian economy, to keep pace with that. But I think if we can watch those patterns and be able to bring them back in terms of the methodologies around them and introduce them not only to the investor community so they're aware, so that when you as a startup go to them and start talking about how you can disrupt using this methodology, then they're more adapted to it and they've understood it in the right context. We need to bring the thinking and the methodologies over. But I mean, I haven't worked within the market from a market and corporate perspective, but from an innovation perspective, I think the process there is so much more interesting in terms of how they actually innovate from grassroots up into the market. And I think we could use a lot more of that thinking.
Yeah. I'll, out of respect, I'll talk offline, but the conversation today is about our friend Anthony, so I'll defer to him. I think that's a great answer, but it's something we could talk about a little bit after the event. I'm curious now, for the partners in the room, any updates anybody wants to share just while we've got our audience together? Anything that's going on in the ecosystem? Vanessa?
Just two quick updates. First, Seneca College is hosting its second annual Applied Research, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Forum and Showcase on Thursday, April. Thank you for the clapping.
Thursday,
work with me. Thursday, April 19th in the morning.
Thank you.
The e-invite should go out this afternoon if
Okay.
I get around to it, so probably tomorrow.
Okay.
It'll be coming to the ventureLAB folks, and those of you who've been in the past are signed up for our mailing list, but if you want to know, ask anyone from Seneca. And with that, another quick one. Just want to quickly introduce Ben Rogers.
Okay.
Has joined the Seneca team as our Director of Applied Research. So any of you are interested in collaborating with Seneca on research, Ben would love to talk to you.
Hi, Ben Rogers. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Vanessa. Any other ones? Chris, you have one too? Yep.
Yeah, last night, Heather Crosby wowed them at Seneca with her customer validation workshop. We had about 85, and Frank was there.
Too.
Yeah, I had about 85 engaged. Next week will be pitch, and then they will be actually doing a pitch deck into our accelerator.
Okay.
But Heather was awesome.
Thank you. Other updates? Belinder.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Belinda Ray, the Venture Center of Excellence, located here with the other folks at IBM. I just wanted to let you know that the third round of the Health Technology Fund is now open for intake. And this is a program focused on improving patient outcomes and getting new and innovative technologies out into the healthcare system in Ontario. And it's a program of the Office of the Chief Health Innovation Strategist, and OCE is administering the program. And over 3,500
great.
attendees and 500 exhibitors last year at Discovery, so we welcome you all to join us at Discovery. Thank you.
So is this the first year, Belinda, that a non-human being is doing the keynote? It must be.
As far as I know.
Yeah, wow. Sophia, the AI robot. Amazing. Thanks, Belinda. Any other updates from the ecosystem? Anything you want to share with our community? No? Okay, good. We got them all out. We got them on camera. So we'll bring it to a close. I want to say thank you,
My
Anthony,
pleasure.
for coming today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us publicly like this. And I also want to say thank you for the tireless contribution you make to the ventureLAB Board of Directors. It's
My pleasure.
You can see, and I hope you had an opportunity today in the hour we spent together, the organization itself benefits greatly from the thought leadership of people like Anthony that volunteer their time tirelessly to the board and throughout the network, to the Communitex, the OCEs, the MARS. This great network that we know called the Ontario Network of Entrepreneurs is filled with people with the kind of expertise and talents that Anthony has. So it's a nice opportunity to hang out the way we did this morning and spend some time together. And thank you all for coming on March break. That's
right.
we appreciate that. So have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Thank you again, Anthony.
Thank you, Jeremy.